All right, here we are at Ocracoke's Community Cemetery, and we've got my dad, Philip Howard, here again. And today, their grave markers, I'm going to get a little closer to the grave markers. We're going to talk about Alice and Theodore Rondthaler. So here is Philip to tell you the story about them.
Theodore Rondthaler was the son of Reverend Howard Rondthaler, a Moravian minister in Winston-Salem. He eventually became president of Salem College and later still became one of the bishops of the Moravian Church. Alice was born in Connecticut, and when she was a young lady, she moved to Winston-Salem to work as the secretary for Reverend Howard Rondthaler. And that's where she met Theodore, and they were married, and they were both in their early 20s. As you can see, they were both born in 1899. In 1935, Alice's mother, Mrs. Keeney, moved from Connecticut to North Carolina to stay with Alice and Theodore. And Mrs. Keeney was suffering from what in those days was referred to as the melancholies. And I understand that she hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. When she moved to North Carolina, in those days, in 1935, it was believed that taking someone to the seashore was a wonderful cure for the melancholies. And Alice asked around. She was fairly new to North Carolina, had never heard of Ocracoke, but several people said, "Take your mother to Ocracoke. It's out of the way, it's very quiet, friendly people, relaxed. It'll be just the proper place. There's fresh air. It's a beautiful little island." And Alice said, "Well, that sounds like just the place for us. Are there hotels?" "No, there aren't any hotels down there, but Aunt Mame runs a boarding house." Alice said, "Well, how do I get a hold of Aunt Mame?" They said, "Well, you just write to her. Just put Aunt Mame, Ocracoke, North Carolina, and she'll get the notice." So Alice wrote and told Aunt Mame that she was wanting to come to Ocracoke. About a week later, she got a postcard, just a postcard, and written on the back in pencil was just this message. It said, "Aunt Mame ain't taking folks no more. You can stay with me, Uncle Gary." And with just that amount of information, she and Theodore decided that they wanted and needed to come to Ocracoke. Well, they drove down to Atlantic, North Carolina, stayed there overnight, and the next day at noon, the mailboat arrived, and they boarded the mailboat. It was a 4-hour trip for the mailboat. This was long before there were ferries coming to Ocracoke. A 4-hour trip from Atlantic to Ocracoke. They were on that boat, the Alita, and about halfway across, before they could reach sight of Ocracoke and they were out of sight of the mainland, Mrs. Keeney turned to her daughter and said, actually spoke the first word she'd spoken in 3 years. "Alice," she said, "where in the hell are you taking me?" Well, they arrived at Ocracoke, and Alice and Theodore immediately fell in love with the island. Instead of spending just 1 week, they decided to extend their vacation, spend 3 weeks at Ocracoke, even purchased an old house on the island at that time. The house is still owned by their family. They went back to Winston-Salem area. Theodore was a school principal. They eventually got jobs with the Black Mountain College, an experimental college in the mountains of North Carolina. But after the war, in 1945, they decided to move to Ocracoke. They came to Ocracoke, and in 1948, Theodore got the job as the school principal, and one of his teachers was Alice. They stayed here for the next 14 years as principal and teacher on Ocracoke. They made a huge, huge impact on Ocracoke during those years. They brought with them a lot of their Moravian, and they had some Quaker background, a lot of ideas about equality and tolerance, and had a tremendous influence on Ocracoke. They were very active in the Methodist Church, and in the community all those years. As you can see, their markers are very simple. I understand this is very Moravian style. They're very well respected people in Ocracoke and made a huge difference to this island.
And their relatives still own the houses that they had back then. They keep them up. They've done a lot of repair on the houses and are still somewhat involved in the community when they come. So it's nice to remember them. All right. Thank you, Philip.
You're welcome.